The following program is a UW-TV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Ross Reynolds. Imagine it is the night before your wedding. A man comes to you and your fiancée and says that if you answer his questions for 15 minutes, he can predict whether or not you will stay married. Would you take the quiz? Would you do the interview? It's not a hypothetical question. Dr. John Gottman, psychology professor at the University of Washington, has just such a test, and he says he can predict the outcome of a relationship with 90% accuracy. Dr. Gottman, thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure, Ross.
I hope I didn't overstate your predictive skills, but they're very impressive. In a half-hour interview, you can talk to a couple, and from the questions that you ask them and the answers that they give, you have a very high percentage rate of predicting whether or not they'll be able to stay together. What are the questions that you ask them in that interview?
Well, we've been able to do it now in 3 different longitudinal studies, so I'm quite confident of this prediction, over 90%. Accuracy in prediction. And we ask them very simple questions. We ask them how they met, what their first impressions were of one another, how they decided to get married, what the wedding was like, what the honeymoon was like, the first couple of years of marriage, their transitions, important transitions like becoming parents. And we ask them about their philosophy of marriage, how they think about things, what their parents' marriages were like, and how their marriage may be similar or different from their parents' marriages. We ask them to pick a good marriage and a terrible marriage they know and compare them and compare their own marriage to that. And we ask them about the history of their experience with basic emotions like anger, fear, sadness, love, pride, jealousy, shame, and so on.
Simple questions.
Very simple questions.
But what are the answers? Give an example of some of the answers that clue you into how their relationship will work.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because you don't have to be a rocket scientist to code these answers. I mean, they're really pretty apparent. So one of our dimensions is just how much room people have in their cortex, in their brain, for the relationship and their partner's psychological world. And guys turn out to be very critical in this. So you ask one guy a question like, well, how did the two of you meet and what were your first impressions of one another? And this guy will say, you know, well, I remember the night very well, and he describes a dance and how his wife looked dressed in a yellow dress and how his heart was pounding, and he couldn't go over to ask her to dance, and then the slow dance came on and it was just the right moment, and she came over and asked him to dance. You know, and you ask another guy, how did you meet? And he says, Anna, how do we meet? So, and it turns out that the answers to these questions, the way...
mean more than a bad memory.
It's more than a bad memory. It's really not, I mean, these people have fine memory. It's just that they're not really, you know, taking very much time to make, it turns out they're not taking very much time to make maps of their partner's world.
What's that mean, a map of the world?
Some guys have kind of figured out that it's important to know their wives, to know, you know, who are the main players in their wives' lives, friends, potential negative people or enemies or rivals, people they're worried about, their stresses, their concerns and worries at work, their hopes and aspirations for themselves, for the family, and so on, their dreams. And some guys are just kind of knowing this stuff and updating it every, you know, so often, having a date and saying, so how are you? You know, how are you thinking about that living room? What's going on in your mind? Are you going to change your office, or are you stressed because you have that big commute to the east side or something like that? They're finding out about their partners, and this basic, you know, really map-making thing that guys do and guys love to do. Some guys have figured out. I mean, we call these guys emotionally intelligent husbands. And the fact that you know this stuff about your wife really is the basis of romance, because then, you know, these guys are doing a whole bunch of other things. They're thinking about stuff that they really love and admire about their partners. They're not leaving the house without knowing one basic thing that's going to happen to their wives that day. Then when they come home at dinner time, they'll say, how'd that meeting go? Or, you know, what happened when you had lunch with Harriet?
Mm-hmm.
You know, how'd the lunch go?
You've written that men who can't accept influence from their wives divorce.
Yes.
Why is that? What
well,
goes on?
you know, we found out that in studying physically abusive men, these violent marriages. Neil Jacobson and I have done this research at the University of Washington together. And after watching these tapes for a couple of years, Neil and I sort of noticed this pattern that these really violent guys, they reminded us of baseball players at batting practice at these automatic pitching machines, like whapping out everything their wives said, even reasonable demand that their wives made. So, we call this pattern really refusing influence. I mean, and it's very simple. You don't have to be a mental health worker to accept influence. It's like, your wife says, do you have to work Thursday night because my mother's coming this weekend? And some guys are saying, well, I was planning on it, but I guess I could work Sunday night. How would that be? And some guys are saying, no way, I'm working Thursday night. You deal with your mother, she's your mother. Mm-hmm. And it's just that pattern of not, the give and take pattern. The thing, our grandmothers always said, in a good marriage, you got to have give and take. This is the give and take. It's accepting influence and being influential. It's part of a process. And it's independent of religious orientation. I mean, you can believe, that the man is the titular head of the household. I have a friend who's a Mormon bishop, really believe, he and his wife both believe that. But it's really about respect, this accepting influence pattern. And it's absolutely critical for the survival of marriages. And it's guys, because women are accepting influence already.
You've not only been able to predict whether or not a marriage will stay together, but what's equally remarkable to me is that you're able to predict how long a marriage will stay together.
We can predict how long. Well, we found this. I mean, this is sort of a basic thing that we discovered. I think Bob Levinson and I really did this, and he's a professor at UC Berkeley. And we've done our longest longitudinal study now is 14 years. We followed couples.
Maybe you could explain a longitudinal study.
Yeah, we take a group of couples and we really sort of watch them and periodically check in with them, usually every year, and see how the marriage is going, if they're still together, if they're separated, if they're thinking about divorce a lot, just the status of the marriage. And we follow them as long as we can.
And you've been in touch with these couples for many years, haven't you?
That's right. So this has been this is the 15th year now we've been following this sample. And we're doing this really with 650 couples right now at different places in the life course. Some newlyweds, one study of newlyweds, all the way up to couples who are going through retirement, who are in their mid-60s now. We've been following them. And we asked the question, what kinds of things predict successful transitions, like becoming parents, like going through retirement. Some people have a great time retiring. For some people, it's extremely stressful, and the marriage makes a difference, big difference. So that's what a longitudinal study is. And Bob and I have discovered that there are two major high-risk points for couples. Half of all the divorces we know, from other research occur in the first 7 years of marriage. So the first 7 years of marriage is a very high risk period for marriages. And then the second period that's really high risk is about 16 to 20 years into the marriage, usually when people have teenage kids. And so the interesting thing is, do the same things predict whether couples will divorce early or late? No, it's different.
Now, the teenage kids I can understand.
Right.
But why 7 years into a marriage do we find a lot of divorces?
Well, it's not really the 7th year. The 7-year itch is supposed to be like suddenly in the 7th year, people start getting the itch to leave the relationship. It's not true. It's really all the way through the first 7 years, people are at higher risk. And the reason really is that this is where a lot of the major adjustments are taking place to being married. And all couples have to make these adjustments. It doesn't matter anything about their personality or whether they're depressed or not depressed. All marriages have to learn how to manage money, how to think about kids, how to set up a home, how to be close to one another, how to balance career and family, and then if they become parents, how to make the transition to become parents. It's a big, big change in life purpose and meaning and identity. So a lot of really big things are happening. As soon as that honeymoon is over and they're home, well, then there's a realization, my God, we're together and we've made this commitment, now what? So a lot of stuff is happening in that first 7 years. Well, what predicts whether people divorce in that first 7-year period is how negative they are when they're dealing with conflict. Can they handle conflict in a way that is gentle, that is loving, that is affectionate, that is kind? Can they accept influence? Can they bring up problems in a way that is somehow softened instead of really harsh?
And yet you've said that doesn't mean that couples don't have knockdown, drag-out battles.
That's right.
That
exactly.
can be a sign of a healthy relationship.
It can be, as long as it's not contemptuous, as long as people aren't criticizing one another, as long as they're staying in there and they're not becoming defensive. So the magic in resolving conflict is this. It's really communicating to your partner somehow, I love you, I like you the way you are, but please change. So it's kind of an interesting dialectic. It's like you communicate acceptance, but you also communicate requests for change.
Mm-hmm.
And the couples who are doing this in a kind of gentle way, in a kinder way is really the only way to describe it, are really managing those 7 years very well. Now there's another group of couples who are not very negative, right? But they're just not very positive. I mean, they're not showing a lot of interest in one another. They're not very affectionate. They're not really praising and admiring one another. So it's kind of like more of an emotionally dead marriage. I mean, this is the kind of marriage where if the wife comes into a party the husband's been at for a while, and she walks in, she would like to see her husband sort of brighten when he sees her. This is the kind of marriage where there's no response, really. Those people, if it's not negative, stay married much longer. But then eventually, that lack of positivity, lack of emotional connection, really takes its toll.
I'm really interested that you have a mathematics background.
Yes.
Have you been able to integrate that into taking a subjective concept like contempt and actually measure that?
Yes, in fact, I'm glad you asked me that. That's a great question, Ross. James Murray and I, James Murray is a mathematics professor in our applied mathematics department. He's a world famous mathematical modeler of biological systems, and he's done research on why tigers have stripes and why leopards have spots, and really creating models for biological processes. He and I and his students have been working for the past 5 years on modeling marriages, and we have a mathematical model that we've created with equations in which we can really describe what's happening in the marriage, simulate the way this couple will be under other conditions, and design experiments. So it's led us to really do these very nice brief experiments on changing the way couples interact, improving a marriage in a half an hour, changing a really distressed marriage, and in a half an hour turning it into a really terrific marriage temporarily. That's the problem. Getting it to last is the real problem. But with this mathematics background, with this mathematical modeling that James Murray is able to really bring to this, we can really lend a lot of precision to moments like contempt and what it does and how it creates suppression of the immune system, how it makes people physically ill.
Everybody gets into a relationship thinking it's unique, and that's part of the attraction of it. They think it's special.
Exactly.
There's nothing like it in the world.
Right.
I guess hearing you talk about being able to use mathematics, et cetera, and apply them to a relationship might make people listening to you think, oh, you're taking all of the zest out of it.
Yeah, right, that's true. I mean, but all we're doing is really, we're trying to, we really describe marriages that are great marriages. And, we have a study, Laura Carstensen at Stanford and Bob Levinson at Berkeley and I have been doing this study for 8 years of couples in midlife and couples in their 60s and looking at great marriages and trying to really, I see researchers trying to take that magic that exists in really terrific relationships and kind of spell it out so that the rest of us can really benefit from it. So I think the magic is there, but I think it's really important for us scientists to really try to describe that magic, understand it from within and from all different angles, and then be able to teach it to people so that they can do it. And I think it's teachable.
We've talked about the words that people say, but you also take a close look in videotaping couples and also in measuring their physiological reactions to what's happening in their bodies. And you've even got some conclusions on how body language comes into play in a relationship.
Exactly, yeah.
Could you talk about some of those?
Sure. I mean, there's, we look at what people are doing non-verbally. As listeners, for example, you can communicate contempt very quickly in just one facial expression that looks like this. So you do this contempt facial expression that Paul Ekman at University of California, San Francisco has identified, and and we can count those on a husband's face, and they're very predictive of the number of infectious illnesses his wife is going to have in the next 4 years. So contempt is our most corrosive thing. It really corrodes love. It's like sulfuric acid for love. And so we can look at these body language things. We can look at things like long eye closures or eyelid flutters and find out that, again, this is Paul Ekman's thinking, that this reflects people going inside and saying no to what their partner is saying about them. So we can take these moments of nonverbal behavior, or if I'm talking to you like this and looking at you like this or sitting this way, these small behaviors, or playing with my hair or with my tie, that tell you I'm not here, I'm really not involved in this conversation. Those really are indicative of what's going on in people's bodies. The elevation of heart rate, and more importantly, a kind of diffuse elevation, where people are pumping out adrenaline, the heart is contracting hard, the blood is flowing fast, the arteries are constricted in the periphery, and so on. Blood flow is shut down to the kidney and gut that really are stuff that happens in marital conversation. It's just like the stuff that would happen if we were about to have a huge car accident and we avoided it. Our hearts would be pumping this way. I mean, we get heart rates of 165 beats a minute when couples are sitting down talking about his mother or the money or sex. So you get the same kind of arousal. So you have to really understand what's going on in people's bodies, because when people get up to that state in their bodies, they can't listen. They can't take in information. They can't problem solve creatively. And so all of these things are really important in our understanding of why marriages fall apart or why marriages stay together. The ability of a couple to soothe one another, to make the marriage a port in a storm instead of another storm in people's lives, absolutely critical in what happens to the marriage.
What do you think about these kinds of results and how they might apply to people in other cultures, to people in various socioeconomic groups? How much do you think your research has been bound to where you live and the couples you've looked at?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that question too, because culture is one thing that I think that we're always dealing with marriages. It's not just, culture is not important just in thinking about whether the couple is African American or Hispanic American or Asian American, or one person is from one culture, one person is from another culture. Culture is important in every marriage because culture is about meaning. Sociologists and anthropologists will tell you that. And when a couple gets hung up on a money problem, money is not just money. Money is about what? It's about freedom. It's about power. It's about independence. It's about competence. It's about safety. It's about security. It's about all these millions of things that mean something. And one person's meaning is different from the other person's meaning. And meshing those meanings is what it's all about for creating a marital culture. And this is true if you study couples in Kuwait who have arranged marriages and are Muslim, or you study couples in any other culture. They're having to create the shared system of meaning. And that's where problems get gridlocked. That's where we get the marital gridlock. Mm-hmm. So you take these really simple, trivial problems that couples are arguing about for years, and that are causing all this pain. It's about culture. It's about meaning.
What effect does a baby have on a marriage?
Oh, it's huge. And the effect of the marriage on the baby is also huge. It really goes two different ways. Now, the Cowans at Berkeley, Philip and Carolyn Cowan, who have been studying the transition to parenthood and really have done the only study trying to help couples weather this transition, find that not having a baby is not so good either, because in the first 7 years of marriage, the couples that didn't have a baby, their divorce rate was 50%. Half of them got a divorce. The couples who had a baby, it's 25%.
So a slightly better chance of staying together if you have a baby,
if you have
statistically.
A baby, yes. But now 3/4 of the people who have babies wind up going on this slow slide toward divorce, where the marital happiness drops, marital quality drops, and a quarter of them don't. And part of our research was really to try to see, well, what's different about the people who wind up in that quarter whose marital satisfaction doesn't go down? Can we tell anything different about them and the 3/4 who really suffer after the baby arrives? And particularly, can we tell anything about the marriage in the first couple of months of being newlyweds? And we can. Again, it's this cognitive room that I mentioned. And men and women are both important, but especially guys. So men who are really taking the time to really know their wives' psychological world, who are really responding to them with affection and admiration and pride and respect, those people wind up in the 25% group when the baby comes. So what's really critical about preserving intimacy when the baby arrives is preserving in the marriage that way of communicating caring, affection, knowledge of one another, and admiration for one another. And so we try to get couples to do that, to nurture that part of their relationship. The interesting thing is that the transition to parenthood is really a major life transition in terms of your philosophy of life, what's important, what life means. Because when that baby's there, well, for most people, that's a huge change. And now people are starting to think, the baby's life is more important than my life. I have these very strong emotions about the baby, and we both love this baby together. So the couples who shift their philosophy of life, their idea about meaning, are really able to weather this transition. And for them, the arrival of the baby enhances the marriage. So it's of a fabric, whereas people think it's like a seesaw. If the marriage is good, the baby's going to suffer. If your relationship with the baby is good, the marriage is going to suffer. Our research shows that it's one fabric for these 25% of couples that really do well, because they're changing their culture. They're changing their own meaning system about what it means to be parents. And they're saying, you know, I want my kid to this and that, you know. Yeah. So
I've always heard that children of divorce are going to have a very hard time in marriage. You found that's not necessarily the case?
That's absolutely true. I mean, there's a small effect that people whose parents divorced have a slightly larger chance of divorcing themselves. But it's not written in stone. It is by no means a strong effect. And we find about 50% of the couples we see are taking what they thought about and what they saw going on in their parents' marriages, and they say, not in this marriage. In this marriage, I remember one couple where both husband and wife said, you know, in our families, nobody ever said once, I love you, I care about you. And in our marriage, we find a way to do that every day. And I asked them, well, how do you do it? And they said, well, we leave little notes around in secret places, and we phone messages and send flowers. We have hundreds of ways of doing it, and we're always thinking of ways of doing it. So it's not engraved in stone that their marriage is going to have to replicate, that the generations have to reproduce the same pathology and hopelessness. Not at all.
Tolstoy said that all happy families are the same, but it sounds as though your research finds quite the opposite, that there are many ways for families to be happy, and actually fewer ways for families to be sad.
That's right. There's really a very predictable cascade when people move toward divorce, where they get increasingly lonely and isolated from each other, and lead parallel lives and get depressed and contemptuous and emotionally distant. But there are lots of ways of having happy marriages. I mean, we find these very passionate, volatile couples who debate all the time. Well, they're fine. Couples who avoid conflict and really believe anger is a bad thing and, we're not going to conflict, they're fine. And couples sort of in between are also fine. What makes the difference is really making the marriage a rich climate of positivity, 5 times as much positivity as negativity, and communicating disagreements in a gentle way, in a way that's not defensive, not contemptuous, not critical.
Can that generating positivity, though, just be fake? I mean, can people just be trying to make happy, but...
Yeah, but a fake's a good start. I mean,
you can't really do it.
That's right. A lot of times, one of the things that, we tell our couples is, you don't have to learn a lot of new social skills, because all of this behavior is there in almost everybody in the way we treat guests. A guest comes over, forgets an umbrella. We don't say, what is wrong with you? Am I your slave? I have to give you your umbrella? We say, you forgot your umbrella. Or a guest spills a glass of wine. We say, no problem, would you like another glass? We don't say, you ruined my best tablecloth.
So maybe apply some of that politeness to your spouse.
Exactly.
There are many more marriage counselors now than there were 10 years ago. There are many more people going to counseling, and yet the divorce rate stays about the same. What's going on?
Well, let me tell you about a study that was recently done where they interviewed all the divorced couples in a large metropolitan area. Less than 1% of them had ever had any marriage counseling, either by a clergyman or a professional. So we are doing a terrible job as a profession, marketing marriage counseling, marital workshops. I think we have a big, big task ahead of us to be able to communicate to couples that, it costs you about $3,500 to fix the roof of your house. You got to do it every 5 years. To spend, like $1,000 on fixing the marriage under the roof is worth it.
But you've been very critical about the way some of those marriage counselors do their work, and
true.
you've said that it doesn't really fix the roof; it still leaks.
That's true. I really think that it makes a big difference to base the marital therapy and the marital workshops on research. There have only been 2 studies out of 65 in the research literature on marriages that have gotten lasting effects beyond 2 years. Marital intervention studies. One of them was done by my colleague Neil Jacobson here, and another was done by Snyder and Wills. And both those studies have 2 ingredients, I think, 2 active ingredients. They reduce negativity in conflict resolution. They make the conflict resolution softer, more gentle, kinder. And secondly, they increase overall positivity, like I've been talking about, which I think is really about getting husband and wife to be better friends. That's what I think it's really about. And those are the 2 studies that have gotten lasting changes beyond 2 years. And our research supports those 2 studies entirely and amplifies how you build that friendship, the cognitive room, the respect and admiration. That's really what it's about. So although I think that a lot of the approaches have really fallen short in terms of relapse after the therapy, the studies that work And I think our research is on the same track of trying to build overall friendship in the marriage and make the way people approach conflict much gentler.
There are a couple of tactics used by marriage counselors that you've been very critical of, and they're very commonly used. One is empathy and one is active listening. What are the faults you find in the use of those techniques?
Well, you know, the model of active listening and empathy, both of them are very similar, is that when my wife is complaining about me, you know, and I'm the villain, she thinks I've been insensitive and too angry and, you know, hot-tempered and stressful and, you know, whatever, I'm supposed to be compassionate and understanding. And Ross, I've seen the Dalai Lama do that. When he came to Seattle 2 years ago, I went there and there was this questioner who asked this really hostile question, and he said, "Thank you very much. I appreciate the courage it took to answer that question." And he was wonderful. But most people can't do that. Not even therapy. Yeah, well, not the Dalai Lama. I mean, I'm sure Jesus did it too, you know. I'm sure Moses didn't do it, you know, so it's hard to do that. And I think it's easier to do when you're not the target, when your partner is talking about something stressful that happened today. And I think that's the proper context for active listening, is in stress reduction and depressuring at the end of the day and, you know, really saying, oh, you know, I've got this situation at work, and then you can listen. You can say, tell me all about it. I can be your buddy. There's a great Bill Cosby routine where he walks in and he says he feels his wife's anger in the air, you know, and he walks over to her and he says, she's furious, and she says, I want you to go upstairs and kill that boy. You know, and his first thought is, it's not me, I'm so glad it's not me. You know, and that feeling of being able to be empathetic is easier to do when you're not the target. I think that's the proper place for it. Marriage counselors have been really saying people have to do this empathy when you are the target. I think if you can do it, it'll be enormously powerful. But my reading of the literature is that only a small percentage of couples can do it. You know, 15% maybe. And I don't think I'm one of them.
If you can't do it, should it just be a timeout? Just not talk about it?
Timeout is one of the most powerful things couples can do to improve their marriages. If they can, you know, monitor when they feel flooded and upset and take a real break, and we find it's got to be a 20-minute break because of the neurotransmitters that are involved in physiological arousal. They don't degrade very easily. It takes time to get them out of the bloodstream. It's got to be a 20-minute period when people are not thinking in their minds, I don't have to take this stuff. And they really have to calm down, especially guys.
We're just about out of time, but for you, what is the major question that you would like to answer next in your research about what works in a marriage and what hurts a marriage?
I think the basic problem confronting our field is how to get changes to last, and how to get couples to sort of not wait to improve their marriage, to do it on a daily basis. Like the Bible says in Ephesians, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. We have to find out how to do that.
And a wonderful way to end. Dr. John Gottman is professor of psychology at the University of Washington, director of the Seattle Marriage and Family Institute, and author of Why Marriages Succeed or Fail. Dr. John Gottman, thanks very much for being with us on Upon Reflection.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.